never slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this.
The article we're discussing today. The article we're discussing today was published in 2 different versions with 2 different titles in July 2015 in the New York Times. One title is Title 1, and the other version's title is Title 2. The author of the articles is Susan Dominus. The story begins on a Sunday in the summer of 2013 in Bogotá, the capital of Colombia. 2 young women, Janet and Laura, are looking for good ribs to barbecue that night. Janet tells Laura, "Let's go near your house in the north of the city. There's a shop there where my boyfriend's cousin works in the butcher section. His name is William. He's a very kind young man with a thick rural accent, and he's good at his job. For example, he'll give us good meat because he knows us, and he might even give us a discount. Let's go there." They go there. As soon as Laura steps into the shop, her eyes fall on a familiar face. She sees one of her colleagues from her company standing behind the meat display. Laura works at an engineering company called Stricken. She's very excited and waves to the guy, but he answers her rather coldly. Laura then turns to Janet and says, "That's Jorge, the engineer. He works at our company." She's a bit surprised that Jorge is standing behind the butcher's counter. Janet turns to her and says, "No, that's William, my boyfriend's cousin, whom I told you about." William is a very hard-working guy. He comes to the butcher shop most days, working morning till night. And he rarely goes out and has nothing to do with Laura's company. Laura is a little confused and says, "Why is Jorge pretending not to know me? Maybe it's because he has a second job and is embarrassed. Maybe he's embarrassed to be in this butcher's apron with his hands and clothes dirty." Janet keeps insisting, "No, you've got it wrong," but Laura is sure she's right. It's actually easier for her to think that Jorge is playing a role for some reason than to accept that this is another person who just happens to look so much like him. It's not just his skin color or the shape of his jaw, cheekbones, and face that resemble her colleague. His entire build, the texture of his hair, his mouth, all the details she observes, even though she can't fully grasp all of them at the time. All these details collectively give her the feeling of certainty that this is the same person. On Monday, when Laura goes to work, she tells Jorge the story. Jorge laughs and says, "How interesting. Coincidentally, I have an identical twin brother who lives with me. His name is Carlos, but we don't resemble each other at all." A month later, one day Laura calls Janet and says, "Our company is looking for a draftsman. If you want, come." Janet sends her resume and gets the job. A few days after she starts working at the company, she sees Jorge. And as soon as she sees him, she understands why Laura had mistaken William that day. Not only do their mouths look alike, but all their mannerisms and body language are also very, very similar, from the brightness of their smile to the way they walk. Janet at that time doesn't know Jorge well enough to go and talk to him, but she takes a picture and shows it to William. William also says, "Wow, he looks a lot like me." He shows the picture to his colleagues at the butcher shop, and they all laugh and are very amused, and then they go back to their work. 6 months later, Janet changes jobs and leaves this company, but whenever she was with her boyfriend and saw William, she thought, "I wish I had talked to Jorge about his look-alike." This question stays with her until one day when she's free at her new company. She sends William's picture to Laura and says, "Go show this to Jorge." Laura goes upstairs and shows her phone to Jorge. Jorge looks at it with great surprise and says, "That's me." In the picture, William is wearing the yellow jersey of the Colombian national team, a jersey that practically everyone in the country wears on Colombian game days. And Jorge himself has seen himself in that jersey many times. This helps him to see the resemblance in the picture even more. He shows the picture to one of his colleagues, who happens to be passing by, and asks, "What do you think?" The colleague says, "You look great in it." He says, "But that's not me." This becomes a mystery for him. Jorge abandons work that day and goes to the company cafeteria to sit with Laura, thinking about how this happened. The first thing that comes to his mind is that maybe his father, who wasn't around much, might have had another child elsewhere. So he starts looking through William's Facebook on his phone and sees the pictures there. There's a picture of William in a butcher's apron, and he remembers the days when he himself wore a similar apron in the lab. He sees that some other pictures look very, very similar until he sees one picture where William is standing next to a friend, holding shot glasses. This picture really catches his eye. He goes to his computer, opens Facebook on his computer so he can see the pictures better. When the large page opens, he sees something he hadn't noticed clearly on his phone. He leans forward so much that his nose almost touches the monitor, staring at William's friend in the picture. He's a boy whose hair is styled like a rooster's comb, but his full lips and brown eyes in the picture are very familiar to him. The way the bottom button of his shirt over his stomach is a little open, indicating he has a bit of a belly, leaves no doubt for him that he has recognized him correctly. He said, "This friend of William's in the picture next to him is my identical twin brother. This is Carlos." That day after work, Jorge walks towards the college where he was studying at night. All the way, he keeps looking at the picture on his phone, wondering what it means. He goes to class, and after class, on the bus home, he keeps thinking about how to show these pictures to Carlos. Carlos was the brother who was a top student in school and always got A's. Jorge was the one who always got in trouble. Now, both of them have relatively good jobs. Jorge is a pipe engineer, and Carlos works at an accounting firm. He also studies at night like Jorge. They live together in a clean, two-bedroom duplex apartment in a middle-class area of the city. Their standard of living right now is 1 or 2 steps higher than what they had in childhood. Their mother was a maid, and Carlos, Jorge, and their older sister Diana grew up in one room in their grandmother's house. They don't consider themselves poor, but well, now they have more than they did then. Carlos can go to clubs at night. Jorge can, for example, go around to watch football. They also feel a little sad that their mother passed away from stomach cancer 4 years ago, and they didn't have the chance to provide a better life for her. When he gets home, Jorge sees Carlos, as usual, talking to a girl on the phone. He said, "Hang up, I need to talk to you." Carlos says, "Don't bother me," and so on. Their dynamic has always been like this. Jorge jokes and teases to make Carlos angry, and the angrier he gets, the more Jorge likes it. The phone call ends. He tells him, "What would you say if I told you that you and I have identical twin brothers?" Carlos looks at him very indifferently. Jorge says, "Do you believe in these telenovelas?" Telenovelas are a type of series popular in Latin America, a mixture of story, dance, and singing, like Indian movies, in my opinion. Carlos gradually gets annoyed and says, "Dad, if you want to say something, say it." He comes and sits him down in front of the laptop and shows him William's pictures in the butcher's apron and the national team jersey. Carlos looks at them and laughs at this strange resemblance. Then he shows him the 2-person picture. Here, unlike Jorge, who was bent over in the picture, Carlos recoils as soon as he sees it, as if the picture pushed him. He returns very irritated and says, "Who are these people?" Jorge tells him what he heard from Janet and Laura that day, that these 2 people in the picture grew up on a farm in a remote village in Santander, a rural area in northern Colombia. People in other parts of Colombia make jokes about the people there, and their characteristic is that they are very short-tempered and very attached to their guns. Then he says, "Yes, they are from there, and according to Facebook, they were born in late December 1988. Jorge says, "Maybe you were switched at the hospital, for example. A nurse mistakenly put one next to another." What he doesn't say is that the implication of this statement is that Jorge and Carlos are no longer brothers. In fact, they probably have no family relation to each other. And again, something that is not said but both of them know, is that if one of these 2 was mistakenly taken from this family of farmers, it's Carlos. Carlos never resembled his siblings from the beginning. They had delicate features that resembled their mother more, triangular cheekbones and eyes. But Carlos is tall, has a stocky build, a wide nose, and bushy eyebrows. And it's not just these superficial differences. Carlos always felt a vague sense of alienation from the rest of the family. Until now, he attributed this to his sense of independence. For example, when they were children, His siblings would play with their mother at home, making funny noises and teasing each other for hours. But Carlos usually wouldn't join these games and would pull himself away. Even after their mother passed away, Carlos checked on their sister much less than Jorge did. Or another difference, he was the only one in the family who followed fashion trends, the only one who danced very well in this family. But they always assumed that Carlos took after their father, whom they didn't know very well, so they couldn't be sure. But they attributed everything to him. Despite this feeling of being different, Carlos's relationship with his mother was very good. He always adored her, partly because she was a very strong supporter. Although their situation was not great, she eventually sent them to a decent school and made them believe that they could achieve whatever they wanted and that their future had no limits. She instilled this in their minds. That night, Carlos closed the laptop and went into silence. Then he got up and went to his room and closed the door. Jorge went after him saying, "Dad, it doesn't matter what happens, we're brothers," and so on. But Carlos said, "Forget it, leave it," and didn't talk about it again. Carlos didn't sleep at all that night. He couldn't understand what had happened, how it was possible that his mother, who raised him, wasn't his real mother. He had mourned her once before when she passed away. Now he was mourning her again, as if he had lost her again. He felt a new sense of helplessness, loneliness, and despair. At the same time, in the other room, Jorge was sleeping as if nothing had happened. The next morning, William opens the butcher shop and his cousin Brian, Janet's boyfriend, comes there and starts working. William has been promoted. His position is now like an internal manager there. He has also hired these boys, who are also students, to help out. On the other hand, William is very close to Brian, in many ways actually much closer to him than to his identical twin brother, Wilbur. Brian grew up in Bogotá, and when William came here in 2009, to the capital, these two cousins spent many days together. They have many more shared memories, so much so that William and Wilbur don't have such a close relationship. Even for a while, when Wilbur came to work for William in this butcher shop, William was annoyed that he wasn't doing things on time. When a customer came, for example, he would be cleaning and wouldn't engage in conversation. He was short-tempered and couldn't be joked with much. He didn't enjoy having his identical twin brother working with him in the shop. As they started setting up the shop that morning, Brian began explaining to William what had happened yesterday after he left, how Janet had shown him the pictures, and what had transpired. William found it very interesting. He remembered that Janet had shown him this picture a few months ago, but this recent coincidence with two brothers made the matter much stranger. He quickly sent a text to Janet saying, "Send me the picture, let me see it." When she sent the picture, as soon as he saw it, he screamed with fear and surprise and started laughing. Janet texted him back saying, maybe he or his brother was sick, and they brought them from Santander to a hospital in Bogotá and they were switched there. But his aunt quickly found a clue and said, "Yes, there is such a story." She said, "Yes, you and Wilbur were born at 28 weeks, and you had digestive problems. They sent you to this hospital in Bogotá." He sent this message to Janet. Janet said, "I'll try to ask Jorge in which hospital he was born. If he was also born in the same hospital, then it's very simple. They must have been switched there." Until that moment, William, like Janet, was absorbed in the idea of putting these pieces of information together. Now, as he thought a little, a wave of worry came over him. He remembered, "I was always different. I always wanted different things. I was different from the rest of my family. The life I wanted was truly bigger than that farm. But I never thought that maybe I was truly different, that I wasn't really one of them." He looked at the meat racks. He looked at his cousin, who was worried. From there, he involuntarily started texting Janet. "Did you get any news? Did you get any information? Did you get the name of the hospital?" A few minutes later, he came back into the shop and showed her Janet's message. Yes, Jorge and Carlos were indeed born in the same maternity hospital. It was confirmed. Then he sat down on a bench behind the shop and his breath caught. Sad and painful thoughts came to him one after another. That he had been uprooted from his rightful place. That he was actually a lost person whom no one knew was lost. How would he tell his mother? His mother had 6 children, but he was the only child who sent her money. His relationship with his mother was very close. This news that she wasn't really his mother broke his heart, just as it broke his heart now. He remembered that only once, just once, he had spoken harshly to his mother. A few years ago, when he had just finished his military service, he had won a good prize that would help him get a scholarship. Later, it turned out that he couldn't take that prize because he hadn't finished school. They had taken him out of school when he was 12, and he didn't have a diploma. And that day, he told his mother that she should have let him finish school. But their living situation at the time was such that the closest high school was a 5-hour walk away. The family needed money to afford a house for him, plus money for his uniform, and registration, plus the money they would lose because he wouldn't be working on the farm anymore. Even now, William thinks that they should have found a way. They should have fought. They should have given everything they had and sacrificed so he could get his diploma. He spoke very badly. He yelled at his mother because of this. That day, as he sat on the bench and cried, he experienced a feeling he couldn't explain at the time. Later, he understood how to explain it. He would say, "My chances were actually taken away from me. Instead of spending all my time on the farm planting, growing, and harvesting, I should have been able to go to a good school in Bogotá. But I stayed with this family, a family I love very much and who loved me very much. But because I was different, they teased me a lot." When Wilbur arrived after that day, William told him, "I need to show you something." And he brought his phone and showed him the picture of Jorge and Carlos. Wilbur's reaction was the strangest of all. As soon as he saw it, he said, "Oh, so we were switched." "So we were." He shrugged his shoulders with indifference and said, "I don't care who they are. You are my brother, and you will be my brother for the rest of your life." The science of twins. Sometimes, a while after conception, the force that binds cells together loosens, and 2 cells that should have stuck together and formed one person a few months later separate and become 2 distinct beings. However, their genes and every cell in their DNA are identical. Identical twins actually start their lives based on a lucky coincidence, an interesting system error. But the formation of fraternal twins is much more commonplace. 2 separate sperm reach 2 separate eggs and form 2 beings. Fraternal twins are as genetically similar to each other as any siblings are. Their resemblance is that their conception happened at the same time, and they were born more or less at the same time. These 4 Colombian brothers, who are now in Bogotá, each grew up as fraternal twins. Now they realize that each of them has an identical twin. Even before they met each other, they had some similar characteristics. Carlos and Wilbur are worried. They believe they should just drop it, not pursue the matter, not get involved, because they don't know what will happen. They don't know what those other people, whom they resemble, are looking for. It's trouble, so they should leave it alone. William and Jorge, however, are more open to the subject. They say, "It's very interesting. Let's see what happens." These 2 are so open to the matter that Janet, a few hours after the matter becomes clear, arranges a meeting for that same day when William closes the butcher shop at 9 in the evening for them to meet in the city square. William and Jorge. Wilbur was initially very reluctant to see the other brothers, but then, as the time approached, he looked at the pictures more and more, and became more and more curious, and said, "I want to go too." At 3 in the afternoon, William called Jorge to see if Wilbur could also come. Jorge said, "Yes, why not?" And it was very interesting for both of them that their voices were not similar. William had a rougher voice and also that Santander accent. Another thing was that when William addressed Jorge, he called him Sir, a formal behavior that people in rural areas tend to have more. Jorge, on the other hand, said that his voice was very good, and he liked his voice very much. As they got closer, William became very stressed and quiet. When he left work, he went to the barber and put on his best sweater, which was a black sweater with gray stripes. He carried his gun, as was his habit, on his waist, and his heart was pounding. When the meeting time arrived, Jorge was standing in the middle of the square, his palms sweating. He looked around nervously, breathing heavily from excitement. A few minutes later, a group started approaching. In the middle of them was William, with Jorge's face staggering forward. Brian filmed this meeting with his phone. The sound is cut, but the video shows Jorge and William as if they are performing a very precisely choreographed pantomime, observing certain rituals and customs. William stares at Jorge. Jorge averts his gaze and looks to the side. Then William turns his head as if saying, "Now I'm giving you a chance to stare at me." What he does is he sizes him up from head to toe. Then they stare at each other's smiles. Then they look away again. They keep looking at each other, keeps averting their gaze, looking at each other, as if this time they want to confess their love. Jorge composes himself and looks at William again. He's chewing gum a little more, and his jaw is working very hard. Then he puts his hand on his chin as if testing, seeing that this is me, and the person on the other side is someone else. William is very quiet, constantly shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Jorge later explains, "It was like standing in front of a mirror, but on the other side of the mirror was a completely different world." Then Jorge looks at Wilbur, Carlos's identical twin. He looks at him and shakes his hand. Wilbur had seen Carlos's pictures before, and he jokes, "The only thing I need now is that," and bursts out laughing. As he laughs, Jorge feels that this is Carlos laughing now. Wilbur also sees how much William resembles Jorge, and he is very eager to see Carlos. Jorge calls Carlos and says, "We're going home." They take 2 taxis, and everyone gets in the taxis and heads towards the apartment. Meeting the twins around 10 o'clock, Carlos hears the doorbell. He goes to the door and stands there, not daring to open it. He gathers his courage and answers. He knows that Jorge and the others must be behind the door, and he knows that the other people there, besides Jorge, are not just strangers. They are stranger than strangers actors in a story of his life over which he has no control. Jorge says, "Open the door." Carlos notices a laugh behind the door that sounds very, very much like his own laugh, but it's not coming from him. It's coming from the other side of the door. In short, they joke around and open the door, and they come in. You see Jorge there and Jorge's identical twin. One of them is Jorge but in a strange sweater, and he doesn't have Jorge's self-confidence. There's a lady, a girl, and another boy, and then this one is Carlos himself, a beautifully transformed version of himself, a photocopy. It's very funny, a joke or a nightmare of himself. Carlos and Wilbur look at each other, and then both of them turn their backs to each other, acting as if they are scared and cover their eyes, and both of them turn red. Wilbur starts talking, but Carlos has a little difficulty understanding what he's saying. His speech sounds more like slurring than clear words. This is the same stutter that Carlos had when he was a child, but had resolved with speech therapy. Then the 4 of them start comparing and asking each other questions to see what they have in common, what they don't have in common. Which of them is the spoiled child of the family? Carlos and Wilbur are the ones who always cried. Which of them are the kind people in the family? Jorge and William. Which of them are more organized? Carlos and William. Which of them are stronger? Jorge and William. Which of them pursue girls a lot? Carlos and William. Even now, while Jorge is secretly looking at William, searching for similarities, Carlos is searching for differences. He says, "Look at our hands. They don't look alike, do they?" Wilbur's hands are bigger, plumper, and have scars on them, the hands of a working butcher. Carlos, on the other hand, regularly manicures his nails, and his nails are shiny. These boys in Colombia do this to make their nails shine. Very neat and tidy. William asks Jorge about his mother, his birth mother, where she is, how she is, what she does. Jorge, looking at him, explains that she passed away from cancer 4 years ago, and he shows him a picture of her youth, with long hair tied back, very beautiful eyes, and a very serious and kind face. As William looks at the picture, a wave of sadness seems to wash over him. He doesn't say anything for a few minutes. Most of that night, the atmosphere in the apartment is good but confusing. They are having a lot of fun. They are enjoying themselves a lot. They find very funny similarities with each other, similarities that are, of course, easier to find than differences. Each of them knows that when they step out of here, a feeling of loss will come over them. Losing their parents, losing their siblings, losing opportunities, losing years, losing the story they think is their birth story. Jorge tried to not give in to those emotions, at least not now. He said, "You know what happened? What happened is that our families grew." Someone shouted, "Which team do you support?" All four of them shouted together, "Atlético and Nacional." It was past midnight when they left, saying they would meet again. Jorge and Carlos looked at each other, feeling that everything was as it was and nothing was as it was. Carlos turns around and says, "I understand." Carlos walks closer to Jorge and hugs him, saying, "I want you to be my brother." Explaining identical twins. Identical twins cannot be easily explained by the theory of evolution. Fraternal twins have the advantage that their genes are different, meaning that if one of them encounters a problem or accident, the chance of survival for the other is higher. This can be explained by saying that their advantage is being twins. But for identical twins, you cannot say such a thing. However, despite their inexplicable nature, identical twins have greatly helped in deciphering and explaining very difficult questions about why and how we become who we are. For over a century, scientists have been trying to compare the common traits of identical twins, whose genes are 100% the same, with the common traits of fraternal twins, whose genes are on average 50% similar, to understand which characteristics in us can be attributed to heredity and which can be attributed to environment. These studies began in the late 19th century and gained a lot of momentum in the early 20th century. Some important scientists who worked extensively on this subject and proposed theories far ahead of their time later became supporters of Hitler and advocated for his idea of a superior, pure race. Although that period was controversial, twin studies rapidly advanced. A very detailed research, the results of which were published this year, I will put the links on the Facebook page for references, shows that genetics influences traits such as having or not having a gun, who to vote for, being homosexual or not, job satisfaction, coffee consumption, insomnia, and many other strange things. Almost everywhere researchers looked, they found that the results of identical twin tests were closer than those of fraternal twins. This leads some behavioral geneticists to say that everything can be traced back to heredity. The more genetically related two people are, the closer they become in every trait you examine, whether it's a personality issue, their television watching habits, or their political inclinations. Fascinating twin studies. The most intriguing branch of twin studies is examining identical twins who are raised apart, because there you have genes that are constant, and on the other hand, you have a different environment, and then you can see what characteristics are similar and what are not. A study at Minnesota University in 1979 found two twin brothers named Jim and Jim who met each other at the age of 39 that year. Not only did they look very much alike, but both of them vacationed at a common beach in Florida. Both of them married women whose first names were the same. Both of them divorced those women. Both of them then married other women whose first names were also the same. Both smoked the same brand of cigarettes, and both built miniature picnic tables as a hobby. They were very similar in personality and very similar in expression. It seemed that they were completely formed at the moment of conception, before the influence of parents, siblings, or geography could begin. Later, this person also studied 80 other identical twins who were raised apart and compared them with identical twins who were raised together, and with fraternal twins who were raised apart and fraternal twins who were raised together. He found that in almost all cases, identical twins, whether raised together or apart, were more similar than fraternal twins in terms of personality traits and, more controversially, intelligence. A very unexpected finding in these studies, however, was that the common environment in which two people grow up has much less influence on them than a specific experience one of them has, for example, spending time studying abroad or having a very important friend. These experiences have much more influence than growing up in a common environment. Of course, these studies also have critics and some flaws. For example, if two identical twins who grew up apart do not resemble each other, the probability of them meeting later is very low. So those whom the media, for example, newspapers, journalists, scientists, anyone, notice are those who have these characteristics of being similar and having common traits. That's why their cases become interesting. That's why they become famous. That's why scientists see them. While there might be many identical twins who are separate from each other whose resemblances are very few and therefore their case is never brought up. There are other flaws as well, but since this is not a specialized article, we won't go into them. Like any research, there are different views and debates on this. Anyone interested can go and read more. A road trip to the past. A Colombian researcher saw the video of the initial meeting of these two brothers through Facebook, found the subject very fascinating, and contacted another person who researches in this field. They contacted the brothers, and it was arranged for them to come and research them. This means that these children had to undergo very deep interviews for a week, and they had to sit for long hours filling out very detailed questionnaires. They were also told that they wanted to write a book about them, and they agreed and were very happy and participated in this work. William set one condition for this work. He said, "If you really want to know what my life was like and where I grew up, you have to come and see the house where I grew up in Santander." He was secretly worried that if he told them how long the trip would take, they would back out. So whenever the topic of travel came up, he would dodge it. For example, he would say, "It's a 4 or 5 hour drive." Then he would say, "Of course, as long as there's a road." Later, it would turn out that they would have to get out and walk. Then they would ask, "How long do we have to walk?" He would say, "You have to walk a little." Then, for example, he would say, "It might be a little muddy though." They would say, "How muddy? How?" He would say, "It's probably easier if you come on horseback." Finally, one day they set off to visit their parents in Santander. 4 brothers, plus the 2 researchers, a translator, and a few friends and relatives, drive for 6 hours and reach the city. They have breakfast there. It has now been 6 months since they first met. They have gone out many times together, eaten, talked about family, talked about money, about girls, about their values, about what is important to whom. They have examined each other very closely, even physically examined each other, standing back to see who is taller. Those who grew up in the city are a little taller than those who grew up in the countryside. Carlos had defeated Wilbur in an eating contest, for example. William won all of them in arm wrestling. One day at dinner, Carlos told Wilbur that Jorge had noticed that Carlos and Wilbur both bend towards their plates in a very strange and peculiar way. These are some of the very funny and sometimes very interesting similarities. Jorge was very comfortable and accepted correcting his brother's grammatical mistakes. Carlos, on the other hand, took his brotherly duties very seriously. He taught Wilbur how to talk to girls in the capital, in Bogotá, how to approach someone in a bar, how to drink tequila. On the other hand, the 2 brothers who came from Santander found it very strange that these 2 city boys didn't know how to shoot a gun. So they said, "We have to fix this quickly." As soon as they arrived at the farm, one of the first things they did was take them to the fields and fire 2 shots. This problem was solved. Carlos quickly bonded with his identical twin brother, Wilbur. Unlike Jorge, he didn't tell him about his love life, or tell him what to do or not to do. He listened to him and just supported him, and they understood each other very easily. On the other hand, he was a little annoyed that he was so similar to him, because it questioned and undermined the feeling of uniqueness and incomparability that he had grown up with, because he was always different in the family. The feeling Carlos has is more like loneliness than finding a part of himself, because despite what he says about being together, he is getting closer and closer to his identical twin brother, William. Jorge and William dress similarly, grow beards, and look alike. On weekends, Jorge usually goes to the butcher shop with William, and he even goes behind the counter and serves customers. Sometimes he sleeps at their apartment. Carlos stays home alone. Carlos sometimes told himself, "I'm glad this happened after our mother passed away. If my mother had hugged William the same way she hugged Jorge, my jealousy would have killed me." In those first few weeks, Carlos sank into this feeling of loneliness, and Jorge tried very hard to comfort him or get him out of this state, but he couldn't. 6 weeks after they had seen each other, Jorge one day told Carlos, "Give me one of your pictures." He took one of his pictures, and on Saturday, he went to a tattoo parlor. He had previously tattooed a picture of his mother on his left chest. Now he sat down in the chair. He came home, pulled up his shirt, and said, "Look what I did." Carlos later said, "This was the best gift anyone had ever given me. This was what calmed me down." That day, when they sat down for breakfast, they teased each other a little, and then Jorge asked a very sensitive question that they had talked about before. He told him, "Carlos, what do you think would have happened if you had grown up in Santander?" Carlos looked at him and said, "Dad, don't bother me anymore. Look around you. See how things are here. See the situation. Do you really think that if you had grown up on that farm, you would have become an accountant, or even found a good office job like the one you have now?" Carlos disagreed with him. He said that he would have found a way, for example, to go to school to get his degree and do the same work he is doing now. Recent research findings. A meta-analysis published last year in the journal Nature Genetics, drawing from 50 years of twin studies, concludes that 50% of every trait and every disease in an individual is influenced by heredity, and 50% by environment. This seemingly simple ratio cannot explain the complexities of genetics for us. For example, it doesn't tell us how genes react to environmental stimuli and how this effect is shown in several generations after us, and what is called the epigenetic profile, which contains our genetic information, like our gene recipe. How is it formed? This epigenetic profile is what these researchers are very curious to know about in these brothers. That is, they want to know which of the brothers' epigenetic profiles are more similar to each other, those with identical DNA or those who grew up together. Although these 4 brothers are only one sample, they help these researchers understand how our environment ultimately changes us, what things are changeable, and by what mechanism these changes can be brought about. The interviews with these researchers were also interesting for the boys themselves. At one point, Carlos was asked about his differences from Wilbur. The answers showed that generally, Carlos and Wilbur are very similar, but in small details, they are incredibly different. Carlos, regardless of good or bad judgment, was generally more pessimistic and more well-mannered. On the other hand, Wilbur was a more cheerful and happy person, got along better with small children and played with them, laughed much more easily, and burst into laughter very quickly. On the other hand, the story is more or less the same for Jorge and William. Jorge is much more imaginative and generally much more optimistic. William is a little more gaunt and thinner than Jorge, much more cautious. And once in an interview he said, "Nothing in life is easy." This is a sentence that is difficult to imagine hearing from Jorge's mouth. A few months later, Carlos one day told Wilbur that he wanted to go see his parents, but without the crowds, film crews, reporters, researchers, and so on. This meeting was much better. He became much closer to his mother, was able to have a long, private dialogue with her. He also gradually became more familiar with the rest of the family and interacted with them, and it became an important step in his getting closer to that family. The final results of their research were a little different from their initial assumptions. That is, as they themselves said, their respect for the influence of the environment increased with this research because the results of identical twins raised apart were not as similar as they had expected. Now, I will try to find some links and reports from these articles that they wrote and post them on Facebook, because I think it would be interesting for anyone who is interested to read them. I myself am a little curious to see what they really found. The last night of research. On the last night, after the research, interviews, questionnaires, and all of that were finished, the boys were taken to a good restaurant that also had a large dance floor. First, They all danced with the woman who was in charge of the research and was actually their host that night, a 60-year-old New Yorker. Everyone was very happy. And then Carlos took Wilbur to the stage and started teaching him a few moves. It was clear right there that Carlos danced very confidently and well. Wilbur always looked at his feet and was a little unsure. His movements weren't very graceful. Naturally, as it got later and they drank more, Carlos started performing some more advanced moves in his dancing, until finally, he went for a move that he and his friend had designed together and named the Matrix move. In it, they bend backward from the waist so much that their back becomes parallel to the ground, like Keanu Reeves's move in The Matrix when he's dodging bullets. When Carlos did this, for a moment, it seemed like he was going to fall to the floor. The stage was crowded. Everyone was dancing. Jorge, William, and Wilbur, each in a corner of the stage, saw the scene and approached Carlos, surrounding him with a mixed feeling of concern, admiration, surprise, and pride. But Carlos composed himself and returned to the performance. It's a very interesting symbolic scene that night. Overall, it was a very interesting night. The boys went from one table to another, from one group to another, joining in conversations with different people. Then they would go to the stage, separate, become individuals, then pairs, then fours, and this cycle continued until very, very, very late.